What's up, y'all? Welcome back to Fish the Moment. In this video, I'm going to be revealing my secrets to catching fish on a football jig offshore. Let's get into it. If you've watched even a few of my videos, you've probably seen me catching fish offshore on a football jig. It's my #1 confidence bait and my favorite bait for fishing offshore. The reason is because this bait is so versatile, and it catches fish in anywhere from 5 feet of water all the way out to 40 feet of water in every season of the year in a lot of different conditions. This makes it a great tournament bait as well as a great fun fishing bait, and if you're trying to learn how to fish offshore, this should be the #1 bait you start to master if you want to be consistent away from the bank. Let's start by talking about what a football jig is. It's basically a jig with a lead football-shaped head that weighs anywhere from 1/2 ounce to 1 ounce. This bait's designed to be fished around offshore structure and cover and needs to be weedless, and that football-shaped head will help it come through rocks, and the addition of a weed guard will help it deflect any brush and cover on the bottom. Recently, I designed my very own football jig with Jewel Bait Company called the Fish the Moment Offshore Jig. This bait is extremely weedless and is weighted differently from any other jig on the market, and I'd highly recommend it to anyone who's looking to start football jig fishing because you're not going to lose as many jigs and you're going to get more bites with this jig over other brands. I've made a lot of videos about this recently and have a dedicated video about this on my channel if you want to learn more, but in this video I want to focus more on how to find offshore fish that will eat this football jig, the locations these fish are using, and the retrieves you need to use to trigger these bass. Let's start by talking about where to fish a football jig. In general, there are 2 key elements that you need to focus on if you want to catch fish in a football jig. The first is a change in cover, and the second is water clarity. The most important of these 2 factors is a change in cover. This could be where you have a change in 2 different types of rock, where you have a brush pile showing up, where you have a difference in bottom composition, or any place where the objects or the cover on the bottom are transitioning or changing. Here are a few examples on the fish finder. This first spot is a classic football jig area. We have a main lake point with a creek channel swinging close by. This creates a drop off from shallower water to deeper water. On top of the point, you have a transition from a pea gravel bottom to a chunk rock bottom. And this is where your fish are going to set up, right on that transition between the smaller rock and the larger rock. This will attract bait fish, and the bass will stay there to ambush those bait fish, making it the ideal place to drag around a football jig. Here's another example of a similar area, except in this case, we don't have a significant drop off. Instead, we just have a transition from that pea gravel bottom to a chunk rock bottom. A lot of times you don't need to have a major drop off or a piece of structure like a hump, a ledge, or a point to hold bass. A lot of times these bass will set up on these changes in cover on the bottom, making them a great place to fish a football jig. Another great place to fish a football jig is in offshore brush piles. Brush piles are man-made piles of wood that have been dropped in the middle of the lake. They work year-round and on pretty much any lake across the country. This makes them a great place for a football jig, and that football jig will actually get you some bigger bites out of brush piles than other baits you can throw in there. Unfortunately, a football jig also will get hung up more than most baits that you'll throw around brush piles, and that's always been something that's been a problem for me over the years. I still threw jigs in brush piles. I would just go through like 15 or 20 a month. But recently, I discovered that double cable guard weed guard that I put in the Fish the Moment Offshore Jig, and it allows you to fish a football jig through brush without any problems. You really won't get hung up hardly at all, as long as you set those cable guards correctly, and I talked about that in that other video I mentioned, and it's been a big game changer for me the last couple of years, especially with my brush pile fishing. And when you're looking for a good offshore brush pile, a lot of times what I'm doing is graphing around the lake, looking on pieces of offshore structure like humps, points, ridges, or any place where guys might drop a brush pile basically, and sometimes this can even be on flat, nothing looking banks. And I've actually made a complete guide to brush pile fishing that explains how to identify fish in brush piles, where to find them, the timing to fish brush piles, everything you need to know, so I would definitely check out that video if you want to learn more. I'd estimate that I catch 80% of my fish on a football jig in either brush piles or offshore rock. But there are a few other areas where I like to throw a football jig. The first is in offshore grass, specifically grass that grows out away from the bank in anywhere from 10 to 20 feet of water, and it's not topped out to the surface. That's maybe only sitting, let's say, 3 to 5 feet off the bottom. This happens a lot on my southern lakes in the winter, as well as on lakes up north when the ice just thaws out, or if the grass has been killed off by chemicals. A football jig will actually come through grass pretty well, and you can fish it on the edge of the grass in that deeper water really effectively. It imitates a bluegill or a crawfish really well, and those big bass can't resist it, making it a great option as opposed to a drop shot or a worm like most of the other guys on your lake would be fishing. Another type of area I target with a football jig are bluff walls. These are the steep channel swing banks that drop from 0 feet of water to maybe 50 to 100 feet of water right off the bank. A lot of times bass will position on the ledges or the drop-offs close to that wall, and you can throw that 3/4 ounce or 1/2 ounce football jig up to the bank, work it 2 or 3 feet off the bank, and drop it down from one ledge to the next. Again, those bass will be sitting up on one of those different ledges, and once you determine the depth of water those fish are in, you can catch a lot of good fish. This is a great pattern in the spring as well as in the fall, but it can work year-round. Because I'm throwing a football jig offshore in brush piles and rock piles 80% of the time, I'll use my electronics a lot to find these areas. There are actually some key things that I look for that differentiate one area from another and allow me to determine if the fish on that spot will bite a football jig or if another bait is better in that situation. In terms of offshore rock, I start by finding these areas with my side imaging. Sometimes they're very easy to identify, like this really obvious offshore ridge with big chunk rock, but sometimes the transitions are a lot more subtle, like this small pea gravel to golf ball size rock transition. Once I identify the rocks, I'm going to mark them on my side imaging with a waypoint. Then I'll take my boat and drive directly over the top of that waypoint and scan those rocks with my down imaging. What I'm looking for are a few dots that are positioned within a foot of the bottom that I can clearly see are separated from the rocks on the bottom. What this means is that the dots will be completely surrounded by black space, and usually you're not going to see a ton of them, maybe only 3 to 4 dots at most. The reason for this is because a lot of the bass are actually going to be positioned in the rocks, and the rocks will cover up those dots in the image and you won't be able to see them. But if you can see 3 or 4 dots over the top of those rocks, that usually means there's a lot more fish down there. This is the biggest key for finding fish in offshore rock with your electronics. You're not looking for giant schools of bass like you might expect to see in the Tennessee River on a clean, flat bottom area. When you're graphing around rocks, a lot of fish will be tucked on the bottom in those rocks and you won't see them. This is especially true with smallmouth bass, but also for largemouth and spotted bass. Therefore, you're not going to see a lot of fish in your graph, and a lot of guys would probably graph over the spot and completely ignore it because they only see a few dots down there. So remember, those bass will be down on the bottom in those rocks, and even if you see 2 to 3 dots suspended over the top of those rocks, that's enough to tell you that there's some fish down there, and you'll definitely be able to catch them on a football jig. If you struggled to interpret the different images I've been showing from my fish finder, I would highly recommend going over to the Fish the Moment YouTube channel and checking out my fish finder and Sonar videos playlist. This is the most comprehensive and detailed explanation of how to interpret a fish finder on YouTube. It's completely free, and I've spent over 1,000 hours putting these videos together. They'll start by explaining how the images are generated and where they are in relation to your boat. They'll go into how to identify fish on the fish finder and differentiate different species of fish from one another. They'll also talk about how to identify different types of cover using side imaging, down imaging, and 2D sonar. There's even a video explaining how to set the settings on any fish finder on the market. If you've been struggling with your fish finder, this is the resource you've been looking for. In terms of offshore brush piles, I'm usually going to do the exact same process. Identify the brush piles with the side imaging, graph over the top of them with down imaging, and then try to look for bass in the brush. Again, I made a complete guide on how to identify bass in brush piles and how to fish them, so check out that video. It'll explain all the nitty-gritty there. I won't get into it in this video, but that's the key to finding these fish offshore with your electronics. It's really that graphing first with your side imaging, then going over the top of them with down imaging to determine if those fish are there. Once you know they're there, spin around, fire on them with that football jig, and you'll put them in the boat. And if you don't know how to cast on a spot that you've marked offshore, I've made a video on that as well that will teach you how to mark the spot, either drop a marker buoy there, or use your waypoints on your graphs to line up on that spot and hit first cast every time. If you haven't seen that video, I would highly recommend checking it out. It will make you a better offshore angler. The other key factor that determines when I fish a football jig is the water clarity. In general, I like to throw a football jig when there's 2 feet or more of water visibility, so clear water. Usually that's because I like to fish this bait offshore in deeper water. Now I do catch fish on a football jig in water clarities that are between 1 to 2 foot of visibility, but in general I like to fish a 10-inch worm or a crankbait in that dirtier water instead of the football jig. It just seems to get me more bites. Now again, this is just a general guideline, and I have caught fish in dirtier water with the football jig, but if you're trying to learn how to catch fish on this bait to start out, go to your clear water lakes and throw it in deeper water. You'll have more success. Next, let's talk about the different retrieves for a football jig. In general, a football jig is designed to be fished on the bottom or near cover. That means that you want to make sure that your bait is in close proximity to the bottom and is in the rocks or the brush that you marked. One common mistake I see new anglers make when they try to fish a football jig offshore is that they don't let that bait get all the way to the bottom before they start retrieving it. This means that they're working it in the middle of the water column, and you're never going to get bit if that bait is not down in the cover you're trying to fish. Assuming your bait is on the bottom, next you need to use the proper retrieve for the football jig. There are several ways to work a football jig, but I found that the most effective is a medium pace retrieve where I drag the bait 3 to 5 feet, let it pause for 1 to 2 seconds, then drag it 3 or 4 feet again. These drags actually pull the bait at a pretty quick pace, and I'm covering quite a bit of water with my football jig. A lot of the bites will actually come right after that bait stops moving across the bottom. They'll pick it up, and by the time you start to pull again, the fish will be on there and you can set the hook. One thing I see a lot of guys do when they try to fish a football jig initially is that they either fish it way too fast or way too slow. When they're fishing it too fast, they'll basically cast it out and just reel it straight in. And this can actually work sometimes when you're fishing a very heavy jig in very shallow water. It's called scrubbing a football jig. But in general, I find that this retrieve is very situational and not the best in most cases. On the other hand, I see guys that fish a football jig way too slow. They'll cast it out, let it sink to the bottom, and then basically count rocks back to the boat. They'll move it 3 inches at a time, they'll let it sit for 4 or 5 seconds, move it 3 inches at a time, and it might take them 5 to 10 minutes to get that bait back to the boat. This is too slow, and I actually feel like a lot of the bites that get a football jig are reaction bites. That jig has a pretty heavy head, and it will glide and hop off the bottom, which will trigger some of those active bass that are down in those rocky spots. Therefore, I recommend using that medium pace retrieve I showed to generate the most bites as well as to cover a decent amount of water. Another retrieve that works great with a football jig is called stroking a football jig. This is where you actually cast the bait out, let it sink all the way to the bottom, then rip your rod up in the air, almost like you were fishing a flutter spoon. This will pop that jig 3 to 5 feet off the bottom, and it'll fall back down through those fish. I don't use this retrieve that often because I would prefer to actually throw a flutter spoon or a hair jig as opposed to stroking a football jig. But there are times when I do it, especially if I feel like those fish are really fired up and I don't want to take the time to tie on a different bait. But in general, I recommend throwing a different bait in there as opposed to throwing that football jig and stroking it, just based on personal experience. Again, the best retrieve is that medium-paced pull, 3 to 5 feet, let it stop for a couple seconds, then pulling it again. That is what I use 90% of the time and was produced literally thousands of bass for me over the years on a football jig. Hopefully this gave you a better understanding of when, where, and how to fish a football jig. And I actually took Randy out to Table Rock Lake a few weeks ago to show him all of this. Randy hardly ever throws a football jig and has zero confidence in it, so I wanted to show him all of this on the water. And we actually ended up catching some really nice smallmouth bass and spotted bass using all of the techniques I taught you in this video. After the day, we did a recap, and I wanted to talk to Randy about what he learned and some of the things that he took away from the experience. Hey Randy, so we just wrapped up the day and we caught some fish on the football jig. How'd you like it?
Oh man, I was going to tell the viewers here, we started out, we were going to make a hair jig video and a swim bait video because Johnny had been catching them on a hair jig. I'd been catching a few on a swim jig. And guys, we fished pretty much all day long and we just could not get them going. I mean, we just fishing deep, fishing shallow. We had about 2 hours left and Johnny says, man, I think we can catch them on a football head jig. Let's just go run some stuff. And what a eye-opening learning experience, because I fished football head jigs in the past, but not the way that you do, because the way that you showed me today is truly an art form, because it's a combination of using your electronics, knowing how to set your electronics electronics, knowing how the fish are positioned on this offshore cover, and being able to decipher the subtleties of everything that's going on in that 20 to 30 foot zone, and then you combine that with the bait, that you designed specifically for what we were doing. It was just great. We fished for probably 2 hours, caught those 4 quality fish. I have no doubt if we'd have done it all day long, we'd have caught a good bag of fish, both of us. So.
And what was the biggest thing you kind of took away from this, Randy, in terms of learning about, maybe first about the retrieve or how I work the jig, how I was fishing it?
I think the big thing on that is the way that you got that jig design. With the wire guards on there, you can throw that bait through the thickest rock and through brush, which most football heads get hung up immediately in brush. So basically, you showing me that you have confidence to throw that bait deep in brush, where most people would have to throw a Texas rig. I mean, that's the big thing that I learned, because I don't associate football head jigs with brush at all, and obviously that works in it.
Oh yeah, this jig is so good at coming through cover. Obviously it'll hang up in the rock just like other football jigs, but around that wood, we didn't hang up at all in the wood all day, and we were both throwing it for 2 hours. We hung up a few times in the rocks, but I mean, it's a football jig, you're gonna get hung up in rocks because we're fishing big rocks.
Right.
So that's awesome. And then what about from like a electronics mapping, like strategy perspective? What'd you learn the most there?
That's the whole thing. I mean, these electronics, it's like, I mean, it is such a fine art as far as knowing how to set them up, knowing how to adjust everything perfectly for the water depth you're fishing, and basically you have to be able to decipher what you see in real time, and be at the right place at the right time with the right technique, which that jig was. Yep. But the thing that I saw on there is what I would consider bass. I didn't really know exactly what I was looking for, and I've got a lot of time with electronics. I mean, I've done it a long time. I know what to look for. But what you showed me today is how these fish were positioned, and how they have to have some type of cover nearby. It can't be just like a clean bottom, but it doesn't have to be much. It can be something. It can be a rock as big as a garbage can lid. Just something for them to relate to, and that was the big key. If you found these bass that you thought were bass that were just on a slick bottom, for whatever reason, those fish were just not active, and they just wouldn't bite. So the biggest thing I learned today is you have to have a combination of some type of cover, irregular feature, along with those fish on there. And you're not looking for these massive groups of fish. You're looking for little wolf packs of like 2 to 4 bass. Toss out a buoy, whip around there, make a few casts, move on to the next spot. It's a deadly technique in the summer.
Oh yeah, and that's so key, guys, is that looking for those few bass, 7 to 10 bass maybe at the max. You're not looking for jumbo schools. If you find big schools, that's better for a crankbait, a flutter spoon. There's other baits you can use to catch them. And on most lakes, you're not gonna find jumbo schools unless you're on Tennessee River or certain lakes, certain times of the year. On most lakes around the country, you're gonna have these smaller groups of fish, and that football jig will pick them off on any lake around the country as long as you have about 2 foot of water visibility and you have some type of cover. It works in grass, it works in rocks, it works in wood, it doesn't really matter. It's just a great offshore bait all around, and it's the #1 bait I recommend to all fishermen if they're learning to fish offshore, because it is so versatile. It works every season of the year, all over the place.
And the thing that I liked about that, and what you told me, is you made a comment that you said that your average bass on that thing weighs like 2 3/4 pounds. Most people get out there in that deeper offshore stuff, and they'll throw a drop shot, a little swim bait, Ned rig, shaky head, and they may get bit, but they're just not getting that grade of fish. So for me, from a tournament perspective, and even people that just want to catch quality fish, there's few baits I think that can match that football head jig on deep structure.
I agree. I mean, we designed this jig specifically to be able to catch spotted bass and smallmouth as well. A lot of football jigs have a big head, they have a big hook, and this bait has a smaller head because we poured lead down the shank of the hook, and we were able to put in a smaller hook as a result. So you can get this bait down to 25-30 foot of water, catch spots, catch smallmouth, but the spots of smallmouth we caught are above average, keeper size spotted bass and smallmouth on table rock, where most of the time, like Randy said, you're gonna catch a lot of small fish out here. And a lot of the spots we fished today, we probably could have caught more fish if we had picked up a Ned rig, a drop shot, shaky head. But if you're in a tournament situation, we got 4 good fish in the boat in 2 hours, and we didn't have to worry about messing with those other fish.
Yeah, and you know, like any other technique, I mean, there's a lot of subtleties to it, because the football head jigs I've fished in the past, most of them are 3/4 ounce. I've got a big trailer on it. I use like the brush hog trailer, like it's a big bulky bait with a hook that's twice that size. So when you're talking about different profiles, different skirt colors, different trailer combinations, there's a lot of things to consider to hit on that right combination based upon the conditions you're fishing that particular day. And for Table Rock Lake, with having 3 species, largemouth, smallmouth, and spotted bass, clear water, that jig profile was perfect.
Oh yeah, I mean, you can put a bigger trailer on this jig and still fish it in dirtier water, fish it for bigger fish. It's not a problem. It's just kind of changing up the bait for the conditions for the situation. And so, guys, hopefully you learned something about fishing a football jig today. I'm glad that Randy learned something, and we were able to help you guys maybe get a little more confidence throwing the bait that I've been crushing him on in all the videos recently. And I didn't plan on even making this video today, honestly, because I've been talking about this jig so much, making so many videos about it. But at the end of the day, when you're not getting bit on other baits, you need to go to what you have confidence in and what you know works really well. And for me, that's this jig. It might be a different bait for you, but if you are trying to find the confidence bait that you know will catch you a fish when times are tough, I would highly recommend making it a football jig, because it's worked really well for me, and it'll work well for you as well. So Randy, thanks again for going out with me today and trying to catch some fish and then learn about the football jig.
I loved it, man.
Awesome. Well guys, thanks again for checking out the video, and we'll see y'all next one.